right now, the game in the SEC that is the table setter for the rest of the conference is Texas-Georgia. Now, we get this game this year. We got it last year, and it was awesome both times we got it. But it's interesting when you talk about this matchup in the context of what the conference is, because obviously with Texas being new to the conference, this hasn't always been the case. But think about previous table setter games. What I mean by table setters is it's going to have a large impact on who plays for the conference title. And by nature of it being the SEC, probably going to have a pretty good impact on who ends up playing or at least competing for the national championship. But previous table setter games, to give you an example of how we're thinking about this, Bama LSU, Saban and Les Miles going back and forth, 9-6 is the final score. I believe it was for what was at that point in time like the game of the century. They ran it back and played for a national championship, Bama LSU. Most recently, Bama Georgia. Kirby got a little pep in his step. All right, the boys in Athens got rolling a little bit. We saw them play multiple times for a national championship. Saw them play 2 years ago, I guess it was now, when Saban had his farewell. We didn't know at that time. His farewell tour, his last year coaching college football. Won the SEC over a Kirby Smart Georgia team that had a massive, massive factor, not just in the conference itself, but for the national championship. So now as we sit here in the new era with the new SEC, again, I think it's Texas and Georgia. The unique part about this matchup relative to the other matchups we just spoke to, there's no division in the SEC anymore. So it's not like we see Texas and Georgia play in the regular season. If we're lucky enough, okay, awesome, that's going to determine who comes out of the X part of the SEC. No, it's like, well, those are the best two teams in the conference right now at least. They're going to run it back in a few weeks in Atlanta. And so this isn't necessarily a take on the conference title in of itself, but I do think when you zoom out a little bit as to how college football is changing in the future and how the conference, or not this conference, the national title race is changing in the future, I think this is big, yes, for standings, like we already spoke to. I think it's big just from a mentality and an emotional side for both teams. Reason why I say that, we talk a lot about the heavy bar factor on this show. Like, we think that your schedule, if it's easy, more power to you. But in some respects, if you have to, what we call lift the heavy bar, you have to play a team like a Texas or a Georgia or whoever else in your conference across the scope of a regular season, that might benefit you when it's time to play some of those more meaningful games in December, in early January, in the national championship. And I think that's kind of the case for whoever ends up coming out of the SEC, of course, but specifically in this game, I hope and pray we get Texas, Georgia on a semi-routine basis when we get the 2026 schedule for the SEC and beyond. But if you walk into a spot where you're playing a Clemson or a Penn State, and you're one of those two teams having beaten one of the other teams, speaking of Texas, Georgia now, there's a little bit of extra confidence now. Right? Hey, we beat a Kirby Smart coached outfit. We beat Steve Sarkisian and whatever the 5-star is he has at quarterback that season. Like, there's something to that. There's something to the emotional side of things, the confident side of things for your football team to have that swagger and that pep in their step. And so when we look, to the future of college football, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Georgia and Texas, in the national title semifinals every other year, if not every season. Like, I genuinely think that the way these teams are built is what modern college football is calling for. Two of the best coaches in the sport. Depending on how you feel about Ryan Day, you can make a case for them being the top two coaches in the sport. They're always, it seems like, going to have top-tier rosters. Look at the recruiting rankings this past season. You had Texas finish number 1. You had Georgia finish number 2. Coincidence? I don't think so. Not saying it's going to be the case every single season, but I'd be surprised if we saw Texas and or Georgia anywhere outside of the top 3, top 5 going forward. Like, they're always going to have what's required. The Kirby Smart effect probably helps Georgia when it comes to acquiring top talent at the high school level. Now, probably it definitely does. But on the Texas side of things, I'm sure the Sark thing helps as well, but we've seen Texas now just straight up win on the NIL front as well. So they're going to have what they need. And so as we talk all this through, what this means for the rest of college football, obviously Texas and Georgia are always going to be in that discussion as long as those coaches are there. I really believe that. But in terms of the SEC, the thing that I think is interesting is the way it applies pressure to an LSU, to an Alabama now in the post-Nick Saban era. Texas A&M, like, if those two schools, and Texas and Georgia, are going to semi-routinely be the class of the conference, and that game is going to have a large impact on the rest of the conference, I think we're in a unique spot now where the kickback effect for those schools, not kickback in terms of we're kicking back, the kickback in terms of we're trying to get back in this thing, there's never been more power put into the hands of those schools. Like, if I'm LSU and I'm tired of seeing Texas or tired of seeing Georgia at the top of the SEC standings, I now have more power than ever as a fan to go do something about it. Like, we talk about Michigan getting pissed off for greatness and how that really was the case, I think, this past cycle with them going and having a top 10 class and having one of the top portal classes. It wasn't just because they started to just care about football more inside that building. No, they had a Larry Ellison get in the game, a Dave Portnoy get in the game. Same deal for these schools like Alabama, and I mentioned LSU. A&M's been in the game. Like, so I think we can see now the pendulum swing little more viciously back the other direction against this kind of a thing where a Texas or a Georgia controls the SEC. But I tell you what, you're going to have to swing with some real force if you want to be able to knock either of these teams off the top of the conference. That's not me saying that other teams won't win the conference in the future. It's not me saying LSU can't get it done this season or Bama or whatever. But when you talk about, again, the table-setting matchups, the table-setting teams for the conference going forward, I really do think it's Texas and Georgia for the reasons that I just mentioned here. So all in all, the pressure has been applied to the rest of the SEC. How they respond now is what I'm really excited to see. Because you keep saying now in the SEC, it just means more, just means more. Well, it just means more. How much more from a dollars and cents perspective? Because that's, I think, what's going to make the difference and separate for a lot of these teams here moving forward. Ole Miss included in that discussion as well. But that's going to be a fun one to watch as that unfolds, dude. A lot of fun. Because those two coaches, obviously, right now, I would say the top of the conference, if not two of the top three in the sport. But it's going to be fun to watch.